Our regular Monday feature with Minority Leader Aaron Johanson to Tuesday. And just to break the mold, he did go in yesterday. Actually one of our guys set his alarm and came in not realizing it was a holiday and got in. Nobody was here, so he went home. You guys, at this time of the year, you don't really have a chance to really not work, do you?
Yeah, 60 days is a really short window to get legislation done, and particularly if you're trying to do it well. So you find a lot of people in on the holidays. And
Out of curiosity, do you have any idea why is it 60 days? I mean, you would anticipate that. First of all, I can remember so many times when the session had to be extended because they didn't get finished. 60 days isn't a long time. And it's not as though after 60 days you all leave. I mean, you still got to get work. Is it expense related or what do you think?
It's set in the Constitution, which, having not been around when the Constitution was framed, I'm not sure.
By the way, let me tell you why, Rep, is because the last time there was a constitutional convention in Hawaii was 1978.
Yeah.
What year were you born?
1980.
Yeah, you just missed it by that much, But isn't it? I mean, I know that
my parents were thinking.
Yeah, and nothing's perfect. But do you think that 1978 to now that there's not some reason to get together and tweak the thing a little bit?
Well, I think that comes up quite a bit. That's why you see
does.
so many constitutional amendments circulating every year at the legislature, because people clearly think, especially at the legislative level, and I think even out there with the people, that every now and then revision can be healthy and just revisiting ideas. But I found sometimes I do wish the session was longer. On the bad days, I'm not going to lie.
Of course.
I'm glad it's 60 days.
And that being said, maybe people ought to understand what the procedure is, because I mean, there's a lot and you can talk about when the crossover's coming up and all of that stuff, but there's a lot of times that a lot of us that are not in the building with you guys every day is we know that there's stuff going through the Senate and there's stuff going through the House, and it's really very similar, if not the same, but doesn't get discussed between the two houses.
Yeah. Well, and I'm really glad you bring it up, because we're heading almost to the midway point.
Yeah.
We're about 10 days away from the true midpoint of the legislature.
I've got a boneheaded question before you give me your thought. After the midway point, is it then too late to introduce new legislation?
Yes. So
okay. That's it.
In fact,
we got a few more days and we're done.
Right. It was actually too late to introduce legislation many weeks ago. But what often happens is sometimes if there's a good idea to resurrect or there's a vehicle to attach it to, bills can be amended both in the House and the Senate such that a good idea can live on. Likewise, the danger is so can a bad idea, which is why vigilance is necessary.
And you can explain for us lay people what these what it means when they say a bill gets gutted, because it'll have one intention and then come back totally unrelated and still be the same bill number.
Right. So, a bill could say relating to Mike Buck and have a really broad title. And one day it could be about supporting the radio station. And the next day, because it's just about Mike Buck, it might have something to do with your house or your car. But it's still relating to Mike Buck.
Yeah, so there's the thin line of adherence to a rule.
So it's very important to pay attention to those titles. The broader they are, the more a vehicle that they could be for a gut and replace.
One reason why we've extended the invitation to everybody to be with us is that we want people to understand how important it is, particularly after the crossover, to pay attention to things. Because I know that sometimes this gutting stuff happens like way at the end.
Yeah, that's
when all of a sudden,
when the
boom,
shenanigans
what happened?
happen.
Yeah,
it's true. And the important thing is, I think what I didn't understand until coming to the legislature is it's important to be able to lobby and to speak your opinion and advocate for your cause the whole way through, because you just can never take anything for granted.
Sure.
So just when you think a bad idea is gone is when it can be resurrected. And likewise, if you don't keep advocating for a good idea, the enthusiasm may just fizzle.
Yeah, we've come to realize that there's no such thing when somebody says it's a done deal, it's anything but done.
Until the governor signs it into law. Yeah. And even then, do we repeal certain things?
Yeah.
So
we're really worried, and a lot of our worries, I think, tied to our fiscal concerns. I mean, we were told by Council on Revenues that everything's looking good. Then we're scared to death by saying, well, this sequestration, if it happens, a big whack of our military money is not going to come here. Some on the front page today of the paper that a ship is not going to be able to be refurbished because of money shortages. It seems like the ice is thinner than we're being told.
I think that's true. There definitely needs to be a prudent approach, because, I'm not doing the jig that happy days are here again. I'm hopeful and optimistic because some of the projections are better, but we'll see when the actual tax revenue collections come in, where we can contrast real numbers to just projections. And so in the interim, what I think it behooves the legislature to do is to make sure that we don't just go hog wild in terms of spending, that we do squirrel away some for the future in case things get bad.
Yeah, and then there's another thing that says, look, and here's what we need to address, because today we found out that there's some suggesting shenanigans at UH in their procurement process and everything else. And we were talking off air, Aaron, about maybe the need for more and more extensive and more accurate, meaningful audits. Maybe that we don't need to raise revenues. Maybe we really got to know where we're spending the money.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a healthy idea, because when any bureaucracy or entity grows to be large with a lot of autonomy, a lot of power, and a lot of resources, there's bound to be some inefficiencies or some things that just need to be looked at periodically. And I think audits and those reviews are helpful, and that's what you're finding particularly in UH, because it's been granted a lot of broad powers, which I think to run an effective university, you do need to have some of that latitude, but it also has to come with corresponding responsibility and accountability.
Okay, and by the way, just as a reminder, we love to hear from you. We are not going to use any of you off air. Okay, somebody you're talking to Raphael right now, or email during our in studio newsmaker interviews. We only take live phone calls so that we don't get accused of stacking the deck, which is the last thing that we want to do. It's 7:15. Representative Aaron Johanson, the minority leader in the House, and we got a lot of stuff coming up, including some specific bills that the minority is looking at that look like just plain revenue grabs, more money. We'll find out more about that. Okay, now, one of the things that I look forward to during the legislative session is to try to figure out what we really need to do and what we don't. Minority Leader Aaron Johanson is in the House, and we're taking your calls only live at 296-KHNR. We got a lot of ground to cover. That's 296-5467. And I asked just before the break, we were talking just before the break about, what is spending and what is cutting. And we have this budget that keeps growing, and the only ways to fund it are by either increasing revenues or by having history help us with more tourists or more military spending. Well, there's no guarantee of any of that. And there are certain things that are on the horizon that just plain look like an attempt to get more revenue. And maybe we should explain how some of those things work. For instance, let me ask you about specifically the story that was in the paper over the weekend. Maybe looking at two different sources to fund reforestation or greenery and trees or the birds and the bees and one of them, the watershed. One of them is to put a 10-cent for reusable bags on fee on, that's a revenue raise, or higher end properties, tax them, or both. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What are the warning signs here?
Well, I think one thing that everybody has to keep in mind is that ostensibly every tax and fee increase has a good purpose, and it's always wrapped in that. And in these cases, I think everybody wants to protect the environment. That's important to Hawaii. But what we have to constantly ask ourselves as the legislature, and what I hope people are asking us as well, is at what price point can the taxpayer afford to just live here? Not just survive, but to thrive. And so, whether it's taxing plastic bags or beverage containers, or increasing the conveyance tax, or increasing fees on a host of things, that's going to increase everybody's cost of living. And we're at a sensitive time. I think if you ask most working individuals and families, everybody's not rolling in the dough, and money isn't growing on trees for people. And
in spite of the fact that they're telling us, things are great. I mean, they're telling us right now, things are great. Things are really looking good. Are they?
Well, I think the economy is improving, and it's my hope that it continues to improve. But as we all know, just because the economy is improving doesn't mean that everybody's money in their pockets immediately follows that same trend. There's always a lag, because until there's confidence that it's a definite recovery, businesses are not creating more jobs, they're not investing. Everybody is cautiously optimistic, but until they become really, really optimistic and really buy into we are in full recovery, you don't necessarily get all that more money in the pocket.
Maybe you can explain this, Aaron, and that is that, every time you create this new buzz, whether it be reforestation or greenhouse or watershed or whatever, then you have to, if you're going to put aside money for it, somebody's got to administer it. That means you need another office or 2 or 3 or 10 or 40 people. Doesn't this action have expanded government as part of it?
Well, I think this watershed project, particularly that's attached to the bags or the conveyance tax increase, would be administered out of DLNR.
DLNR, of course.
I
Existing staff?
I haven't heard how many additional staff that they would hope to administer the program, but I do think it comes along with some additional staff and infrastructure, to protect this watershed.
Yeah.
So.
But doesn't always one have to ask yourself, and maybe you do this yourself or somebody in your office helps you, to try and differentiate between a new department or a new tax or a new thing, how much is actually going to what we're told it's going to, and what's to manage it.
You do, and I think we constantly, people of Hawaii would be better off if more in the legislature asked themselves, what's a nice to have versus a need to have?
Yeah, and we've heard that a lot. Do we need it? I mean, some people's campaigns have been built on it, and that is true. But I think that families get together, hopefully more often than they used to, and say,
around the kitchen table.
Here's where we are.
Yeah.
The bucket's empty, and here's what we're putting into it every month, and here's what's going out. Who can suggest what to cut?
And you see that a lot. I mean, I learned from my grandma. She had an envelope system, and she parceled out money back in the old days.
Yeah.
Rent and everything.
Whatever
came
happened to
first,
that process? That used to our family did that too.
Our everybody's fiscal house was in order more when that was the dominant norm throughout all the kitchen tables in America.
Yeah. And we have changed dramatically since then. We're looking at a whole bunch of things to once again changes, and I'm wondering some relief by conservatives and by moderates that some of the bills have fallen by the wayside. For instance, it doesn't look like there's any more viable gambling stuff on, but that doesn't mean that something can't come up towards after the crossover, right?
Correct. I mean, if you have a title as broad as relating to economic development, that could potentially be a vehicle,
a casino
for
bill
gambling.
or whatever. Yeah.
Or lots of things constitute economic development. So there's always a chance. I think people can't really breathe a sigh of relief until the session is over with.
Somebody wanted to know, and even though I don't take calls off the air, this is not an argumentative one, but is there chances that some of these bills get altered after they've been voted on, and they've been voted on for what's in them, and then things get changed?
Yes, that's an excellent question, and that often happens. So you can introduce a bill and you can vote on a bill that's a really good bill, and then magically it changes overnight. And sometimes when people have wildly disparate voting patterns, that's why, because all of a sudden a good bill has become a bad bill, or vice versa.
Boy, it must take an awful lot of sidewards concentration and late night burning of the oil to read through some of these things.
It does.
Yeah,
it does.
Yeah, you mentioned before, because you've had this great Washington experience. I'm not sure that very many people have read the Affordable Health Care Bill, but isn't that an example of something that is so encumbered by additional stuff that it's probably pretty hard for anybody to really understand it?
Well, and I think even when you're having to implement it, you're seeing that at the federal level at HHS. There are different things in HHS that they're having to realize, this is a little challenging to implement. We weren't sure how this was going to react. We may need to scale back some of these fees or these fines. And it's, if anything, is several thousand pages to create. Implementing it is going to be multiple-fold more cumbersome.
Yeah, I must tell you, our dear friend David Ramirez from Tax Relief Service does pro bono tax consulting on the radio force at this time of the year about taxes. And, the tax codes are so cumbersome that the only people making any money are the people that write the codes and the attorneys that try to interpret them. So, I mean, doesn't keep it simple really sort of rear its ugly head here?
Sometimes I think that's a great moniker for legislation. Some of the best legislation we see is a page or two at the Capitol, because all it is literally changing one thing, tweaking one thing. It's not too cumbersome to understand, not too complex, and it makes a simple but elegant change to the law.
Let me ask you this, because I just asked about gambling, and right now those that are against gambling are breathing, sort of a collective sigh of relief, at least at this point. And there are a lot of others that thought that, well, this is the year that we're probably going to do something about legalization of recreational drugs, or marijuana in small amounts. And now that looks like we're not joining Washington and Colorado yet at this point. But I want your response on that. Plus, I know that Representative Thielen is really pro the hemp bill because
Industrial hemp.
Industrial hemp, and looking at grasping at straws and things that we can do to help agriculture, that looks like a no-brainer. What are your thoughts on both the legalization of marijuana that seems to be tailing off and the resistance for whatever to the industrial hemp?
Mm-hmm. Well, on the legalization of marijuana, I should point out that not all Republicans have the same stance. I personally, though I'm glad that the issue is not moving forward, I think the social costs that we would find ourselves experiencing a greater would really offset sort of any of the benefit that some of the people claim. I mean, I subscribe to law enforcement's claims that I think it would increase sort of the social harms that are out there. So I'm personally glad that that's not moving. I think what you see with the legalization of marijuana, or in this case, the lack thereof, is a lot of the most controversial issues this legislative session are starting to fizzle out. I mean, they always come out with a bang, and people get understandably very concerned, and they should be. And then I think you see democracy in action, people lobby, and there are lots of great examples this particular legislative session of where people spoke out and people advocated. You would never have a repeal of the Public Land Development Corporation if most of the politicians didn't think it was
I'm really glad,
unpopular.
Aaron, that you brought that up, because after the news break, I'd like to talk about that a little bit as specific evidence of wow. People squawked and everybody sort of listened this time.
I will say on your industrial hemp question, though, I think Representative Thielen's been a great emissary
for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I have a hemp aloha shirt from her, and I've seen hempcrete that people can build buildings with. So
I have one of those shirts myself. and my thinking is that I'm not sure of why there are naysayers. If we can be told scientifically or chemically that this is a different product than what people are smoking in Waikiki in front of the cops every night. What in your opinion, what's the holdup?
I think it's difficult sometimes for people to get their head around, and not everybody has a friend like Cynthia Thielen who can educate them so well and passionately.
Well, but nonetheless, there are other bills that we're looking at to either make it easier or more difficult for agriculture. I mean, we've got a lot of land that maybe before we kiss it goodbye. Because I want to talk about the PLDC for a little bit after the news break, but what about the thoughts that it looks like the measures to develop and use for revenue properties around schools, it looks like that's sort of tailing off this year?
Well, actually, that is the one potential iteration of the PLDC that is moving forward. So in committee, actually, on Friday, 3 joint committees, Education, Water, Land, and Finance, actually passed the bill out. It's called the 21st Century Schools Bill. Now, what I will say is there have been significant changes made to the bill that make it a lot less like any vestige of the Public Land Development Corporation.
Yeah, because wasn't that a concern? Was look, when it comes time to land, that's all we've got. And before we deal it out, let's really make sure that we're doing the right thing. Wasn't that the concern?
There were, and there are a lot of legitimate questions raised about potential usage of the land and whether that comports well with the educational mission.
Whether it's right next door to a school or whatever. Yeah.
Right. So I mean, I think there's a lot of workability, feasibility questions, but the idea still, at least at this point, has some life to it.
Okay, we're going to talk when we come back after the news break with Aaron Johanson, the minority leader here. Right after we're going to talk about the PLDC and the great way in which the whole process was illuminated. Okay, something goes out, you don't like it, you let everybody know, and they say, wow, we had no idea that people felt so strongly about this. And there are some other bills that you may want to feel just as strongly about. We will not take, I'm going to look at my email now during the break, but not with regards to Rep. Johanson. If you want to talk story with him, it's easy. The only way you can do that is live, and call up Raphael, and we'll get you on right after the news break. How can you get upset listening to the sweet Georgia Brown, watching Meadowlark and all them Globetrotters? All right, well, we're trotting around the big square building this morning. Representative Aaron Johanson, the minority leader, joins us, talk story. We do this usually on Mondays, so tell everybody to come back on next Monday at 7, but today's Tuesday that feels like a Monday. And right before the break, we were talking about the effectiveness of communicating your thoughts, yay or nay, on pending legislation or on current government. And what came under real scrutiny of late, and there's certainly some major changes being made, and I wanted to get into this segment with Aaron and you, if you'd like, on the PLDC. I think that, first of all, before it started getting to the headlines, a lot of people didn't even know what it was.
Yeah,
and then when they found out what it was, they found out they didn't like it too much, and they started telling everybody, and it made a significant difference in the way it's being literally disbanded.
Well, and this is a case of the devil's in the details. When the initially enabling legislation was approved, everybody thought, great, public-private partnership, sure.
That's what we need, more of that. Yeah.
Right, and in concept, that's very good. I think what people started to find out, in the year after it was initially passed, is that it was questionable about how much community input there would be. It was questionable about whether this was circumventing existing environmental regulations, and just whether it was a transparent, accountable mechanism. And as it was an interesting nexus of people who ended up opposing it, and you got this broad consensus, which led to really bipartisan support for its repeal. I mean, there's the bill that
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, the bill that's passing out of the House is a bill that has almost our entire caucus as co-introducers, along with most of the majority members.
Aaron, let me ask you this, because I think this is important, and that is that there are many that said, "Look, don't throw it out. Let's fix it." Was the opinion in the ledge that there's so much mistrust about it already that it really can't be fixed?
I think that's the best way to describe it. And every bill, I think, has some worthy concepts, and it's not as though this didn't have some good ideas, and I think it started with good intentions. But because the suspicion level is so high, and because there was a lot of perception of process fouls in the way it ended up getting altered in subsequent iterations, that there was a real feeling of just needing to start afresh without encumbering some of the baggage that exists with the current PLDC.
The other day we had the opportunity to spend a little time with Laura Thielen about this, and she was the one that actually introduced on her in the Senate the repeal bill, but said even though her feeling was, and I don't know what your feeling is, but even though it's getting repealed, some of the stuff that was considered the worst of it looks like going forward anyway.
Well, I think it depends what bill you're looking at, and it ultimately depends what bills pass out of the legislature. But some of the bills that the House felt like contained some of the provisions of the PLDC just under a different name or under different auspices. Many of those bills haven't passed, whether it's harbors and parks or a bunch of other bills. Those haven't passed out of the House.
Okay, we were talking earlier, and by the way, if you have questions about PLDC that I failed to ask, and you want to ask Rep. Johanson that, you can do that yourself by calling us at 296-5467. We were also talking in the break about some of the other things that were enhancing revenue. We talked a little bit about the plastic bag, and we talked a little bit about the conveyance tax. But there are a lot of other things, and it is my worry that enough of us out there, we see a little red herring and we go following off this and following off that, and we don't understand that there's an awful lot of bills that are more than simmering, that are kind of boiling, that are increasing revenue. What are some of them that you could call attention to? Sure.
I mean, there are tax and fee increases on a host of things that range from things like marriage licenses, vital records fees, to, we talked about the plastic bags, but to beverage containers, to, a sugar beverage tax. So you sort of, you look around out there, and there's probably some vestige of an idea in the legislature to tax it.
Here's my question, and I tried to run the numbers the other day. I keep telling this audience, do the math. And I use the number 1 million because it's a round number. And when somebody says something's going to bring in $37 million a year, I say that's $1 million for each of us. So if you're a family of 4 taxpayers, that's $37 times 4 on that. There doesn't seem to be a compilation anywhere where you can look. If all of these bills go through, this is what the average family is going to have to pay. But Lowell Kalapa looks at that. You guys look at that.
We do. And, I don't know that everybody in our body does it well, and everybody considers it to different degrees. But I know particularly in the minority caucus that's a strong concern that, sometimes at the legislature we have this tendency to talk about things as though they're just a few pennies here, a few pennies there. But, all these pennies add up. And
they keep telling us that.
Yeah.
Penny saved, penny earned, and all that stuff.
Especially for people in Hawaii. I mean, those pennies make a huge difference because everybody is basically at the margin right now.
Okay, now, there's one thing that we're looking at nationally and locally, and I want your pros and cons or your thoughts on the governor's desire to see an increase in the minimum wage and what that does to entrepreneurial businesses and small businesses. What is the caucus is thinking And if you can't speak for the caucus, what is your own thinking about a hike in the minimum wage in Hawaii?
Look, I mean, I think everybody wants to see workers well compensated. What's absent from a lot of the minimum wage discussions at the Capitol is that wages can actually be improved for workers if there's broader economic growth and if small businesses are flourishing, because they would likely pay higher wages to attract and retain top talent. One of the things that I thought was so sad but so true, and often left out of this story because folks are busy running their small business, they don't have time to necessarily come down to the Capitol, but the owner of Bubby's, local shop,
sure.
one that most of us have been to, came into my office the other day to say, if these minimum wage bills pass, I will, this is the cost that will go up according to these minimum wage increases. Right. I will not be able to stay in business. I will definitely close.
Not only did he do that, but we have we're like a house of cards, right? Or pickup sticks. We're all leaning on each other here, and we have the domino effect. I've had so many calls from business folks that are business owners right now that are on their way to work, and by the way, we're getting a tremendous amount of email saying thank you for Representative Johanson, being with you, and I want to thank you. Thank you for
it's my pleasure.
Accepting our invitation and also being willing to get up at dawn's early crack before the ledge and do this. But I think
it's a great way to start the day.
I think that you're right. And I grew up in the retail business in Waikiki, and every time there was a minimum wage increase back in the day, we had to say, well, how do we do this? I mean, outside of increasing somebody's responsibility, an increase in the minimum wage for us is an increase in our retail prices. And we're already at tilt with some of them.
Well, and this came up because one of the governor's bills is tying, after an initial increase, it would tie the minimum wage to any increases in the consumer price index.
Or price index.
Yeah, and one of the things that has been completely absent from the discussion, and I'm very sympathetic. The CPI tie comes out of this notion from the legislature that, wages don't keep up with the cost of living. And I agree. Sometimes wages don't keep up with the cost of living, but we can also focus on bringing down the cost of living. We don't have to just presume that the cost of living will always go up, which is why we should always increase the minimum wage. Why not tilt the thinking a little and say, you know what? Yes, cost of living is a problem. So let's bring it down so that the wage that you get is actually more meaningful and you have more discretionary income.
There used to be a program, and I know that there is a semblance of program now, where actually small businesses got compensated for taking in untrained workers. For a certain amount of time. In other words, okay, you need guys that can that are good at machinery. We got a kid here that wants a job, but he doesn't know about machines. We'll pay you $1 an hour as part of what you pay him to do. And that's still in existence. You would think that kind of thinking would get an untrained workforce into a trained workforce. I mean, I don't know how many people have minimum wage workers anymore anyway.
Well, and actually that's one of the points that the Bubby's owner brought to my attention. He said, these minimum wage increases, besides hurting the overall business, are most likely to affect those people who are part-time employees and those people who really actually need the money because, they're not salaried employees. And he talked about his staff in particular was a bunch of college students.
Well, remember back in the day, it used to be, and it probably still is in some circles. I know that we had a tremendous number of employees working 19 hours a week because at 20, they broke that threshold where you had to give them benefits. It's not that we didn't want to give them benefits, but we couldn't afford to do that. So that was, and some of our part-time, less than 20-hour workers were working 19 hours for us and 19 hours down the street and 19 hours down the street from them. And people that are industrious will do that. So I mean, but where do we end with that? What is the likelihood of this increase going through?
I'm not sure because I think people just are not sure if there's the will to do that. I mean, it's one of those things that at the legislature, it's difficult to oppose because it sounds like you're not for the worker. But I think if you can make the case that you are for the worker, but there are other ways to alleviate the plight of the worker, whether it's reducing cost of living or making sure that whatever wages they do receive are more meaningful, you can be for the worker too, as opposed to pursuing a policy that might be counterproductive because it ultimately kills the job creators and the people who actually employ.
There you go. So, I mean, take a look at this, by the way. And the real sadness is that if you have people in Hawaii, say a husband and a wife, and if they're both making the minimum wage, they're living below the poverty line. and that seems so unfair. But yet, it is certainly not within their ability to control what their cost of living is.
Well, and I think I'm not categorically averse to any increase in the minimum wage, but I think it has to be well timed. It should be well timed when we really are economically flourishing, so that it's not a huge question for the business out there. They've got a little
Is there
more
any
time.
way? I know that an increase in the minimum wage puts more money through the system, creates more spending. But is there any way that businesses that would be affected by that could be given some sort of incentive or some credit for keeping their staff?
Yeah.
In other words, for me in the retail business, it would have been simple. We would have had a meeting and said, okay, we got 350 employees. Minimum wage going up $1. Now, guess what? We have 330. Let's make it work. But that puts, and this is a great point by a retailer the other day. In the retail business, where the minimum wage is felt, that if you don't have enough people covering your floor in tough economic times, your shrinkage or your shoplifting will multiply to the point where you may not be able to stay in business.
Right.
Not good, is it?
No.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, more coming up, including your opportunity to chit-chat. 296-KHNR is the number. Please, I'm getting a bunch of email, but we are not accepting email questions as much as we'd like to. We need you. And you may talk to Raphael off the air. 7:47 traffic time. Malin Moore, he's got the scoop.
To talk to Mike or his guests, call now at 296-KHNR. That's 296-5467. Now, here's Mike on AM 690 KHNR.
And with us on this Tuesday that feels like a Monday is Rep. Aaron Johanson. Of course, as you know, the minority leader this year, and it's interesting because it's a small caucus, and yet we do have
Small but dynamic.
I was going to say that, and I heard that last time, and I think it's true, and I think that what we're seeing is even hardliners, Democrats, realize that if you don't have a two-party system, even some Democrats disagree with the party stance on certain things. And let's come back to what we were talking about before, when there seems to be even concern among Democrats that this minimum wage thing shouldn't be entered into too hastily.
Yeah, and I think people feel that. Now, the difference between what you see sometimes in the way that people communicate in the legislature is sometimes people are just doing things behind the scenes because they know that they have a greater efficacy of potentially killing an idea or halting a bad idea from moving forward by working behind the scenes. Some people, feel like they need to get on the floor and blast it. And everybody, I think there needs to be a mix of tools in the toolbox to make sure that we just get the best legislation for the people emerging out of the legislature, whether it's through a subtle or
that seems
direct.
so clean and good way to go. But let's talk a little bit about small business, because a lot of these bills right now are looking at small business, the bag fee, and who's going to, if they're going to collect it, who's going to pay for it, and all this kind of stuff. Are we right in the assumption that Hawaii has a larger percentage of small businesses than many other states?
Small business is definitely the backbone of Hawaii's economy, and it still continues to be that, even though we don't have the world's greatest business climate here.
Yeah, and
I think that's due in large part to the intrepidness of a lot of our small businesses. I mean, they just keep plugging away.
Yeah. And, not all of them are in the visitor industry. A lot of these people are just people that are servicing people that are. You must get a kick out of it when somebody says, you know what, I don't know why there's all this fuss, because I don't have anything to do with tourism.
Yeah, I mean,
don't we all?
We're all part of one system here in Hawaii, and it's because it's a smaller, more interdependent economy. We're all really, really joined at the hip.
Okay, we had a couple of off-the-air questions about the crossover. We're getting closer and closer to the midway point of the session, and you said earlier that there is really, we're past the point where new legislation can be introduced, but existing bills can certainly be manipulated around. When is the changeover or the crossover?
The crossover is March 7th,
Yep.
I believe. So it's first week of March. I might be wrong on the exact date, but
So
that's when the House and the Senate flip their bills, and then when we go through this same committee hearing process again and decide whether we want to just take the other chambers' bills or amend them, and then we move to conference and work out the
Is it generally
differences.
that it's usually a blending of the bills?
typically you see some harmony in the idea or in the general concept. Sometimes you have wildly divergent ideas.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's a strategy. Each respective chamber will try to maintain its prerogative. And if they know one is a priority of the other, it just depends how collaborative the chambers are trying to be.
You know, Aaron, earlier we talked, and this I think is important, about the effectiveness of the reaction against the PLDC. There must be others. There must be a lot of other bills that you guys are working on hard to get the word out that this may not be right or this may be right. And most of them are revenue enhancing bills. And it seems to me there's an inordinate amount of them. We just don't know what they all are.
There are, and you know, unfortunately, there's not enough news time for the average news soundbite to cover all of these bills that really will impact people's lives, impact people's small businesses, and impact just the quality of life for people. And that's really what we're focused on in the Minority Caucus.
I have experience that most of the time, if we mention a House bill or a Senate bill, it has effectiveness, and that's what I'd like to do is start taking a look at some of these as we go through these weeks. Particularly after the crossover, is when it's time.
There'll be windows
and how to do that. In other words, and how to say, look, this bill, it looks this way, and we pro and con it. And I know that isn't that what you do personally? I mean, you look at the pros and cons, then you make up your mind how you are going to vote, and more importantly, how your constituents would want you to vote on it.
It is how we do at an individual level, and what's really exciting about where we are in the legislature right now is because there is a bipartisan governing coalition. There's more receptivity to a broader swath of ideas than I found seem to exist in the past. And there actually are some good ideas emanating from this bipartisan coalition that I think is actually going to make a big difference for Hawaii. And particularly when you're only 7 people out of 51, that's when you need to force multiply and figure out where there is that common ground that's really going to benefit all of Hawaii. And we've talked a lot about some of the bad bills, but I think to end on an optimistic note.
How about a good one? Are there some good ones this year?
There are. I mean, I think
I'm being facetious, but I hope so.
I think there are, and Chair Luke, chairwoman of our finance committee, talked about some of her stances on certain taxes in the Star Advertiser a while ago in Richard Barreca's column, and she really had some great ideas that I think most people in Hawaii feel about not taxing necessarily everything, and. As a result, I hope we will see some broad-based tax relief. I think you're seeing greater transparency with the repeal of the PLDC, and there is some common ground, and I think working together, not necessarily just always fighting, which you see mostly throughout each state and even at the congressional level, hopefully that's going to yield some positive results for all of Hawaii.
What I hear a lot, and I'm sure you do too, is that we have one senator and fewer House members than we've had for a long time. And this is nationally, the Republican Party is trying to find identity. Is there an identity crisis here too, or is it that and you've had a good chance to look at this. I mean, you've been elected, and getting elected as a Republican in Hawaii is a fait accompli in the first place. But there must be, as sometimes people, young people or not, that are saying, I don't know if I want to get into that battle because there's just not enough of us.
Well, I think what people need to decide from the get-go is what they're doing it for. If I just want to make a positive difference, and as cliche as that sounds, that's what helps me at the end of the day be a part of a group that may only be 7 people out of 51.
Right.
But if there isn't some type of balance in government, if we don't preserve those checks and balances, and if it doesn't at the end of the day be about the quality of ideas, but also about one's posture. I mean, one thing that we are really trying to achieve in the House, not just to be a de facto part of a coalition, but also to work in a manner that engenders mutual respect and greater resonance for our ideas, which often cannot be achieved if you don't have some level of mutual respect and stability.
The thing that I like, Aaron, you mentioned this last week, and maybe, like I said, we leave on a high note, that there are a lot of people in the legislature in both parties that really do get down there in the morning and say, all right, this needs to be done for all of us. And what are some of those that are maybe that we can hang our hat on one today that you would like to see enacted that would be good for all of us?
Well, there is quite a bit of talk about broad-based tax relief. And as much as we've talked about specific taxes, I hope that's something that we'll see. That's something that's been bantered about. I certainly think the PLDC affords a great sort of way to begin the session of bipartisan support of repealing something that maybe didn't have the most transparency and was suspect in the public's eyes.
I'll tell you what I'd like to take a look at next time, and that is the number of bills that may or may not affect certain factions or parts of the solar industry, because I do know that that's a big key, that the solar installers are all crying foul because, the credits are going away, and homeowners and stuff, and there's a number of people who are saying the government shouldn't be a lending institution. I mean, if you want it, it should be maybe the power company can work it out. So there must be several bills that deal with this.
There are.
Yeah.
In fact, you brought up some of the governor's bills that are existing, whether it's the actual loan financing mechanisms or reductions in the credits. But that's a really hot topic at the legislature right now, because there's this tension of how do we try to achieve some critical mass in the renewables energy industry, which Hawaii might have a market advantage in, but also not just bleed ink on the balance sheet.
A good point. You say this is a hot item, and it is. It's all to do with the sun too. Representative Aaron Johanson, thanks for being with us. See you next week.
Great to be here.
Okay, and I'll be back right after the 8 o'clock report on KHNR, Hawaii's Intelligent Talk, Hawaii, because it is 8 o'clock.